Hello everyone and welcome back to Study Tonight with Abhishek, and this is a new video in the ReactJS season 2 where we talk about useReducer hook. Yes, it's been quite some time. I wanted to cover this hook in the season 1 itself, but because of some reason I missed out on this particular hook and I missed out a big time. Yes, till yesterday I had no idea that I had to cover useReducer hook as well because I completely forgot about covering this particular hook, and someone reminded me on my Instagram channel Abhi Tonight that why don't you please cover about Redux and useReducer, and then I was like, oh my goodness, I have not talked about useReducer. So in this video we'll talk about useReducer hook, and we will try to implement a function using which you can make a fetch call and handle the states of loading, error and data and display them in the user interface. Now you can obviously do that using useState, but in this particular example, we'll talk about how you can do that using useState and how useReducer can make it a notch better. Yes, useReducer and useState are almost, like brothers and sisters. useState can be used for basic simple implementation of states, and useReducer can be used for a bit complex state implementation. You can still manage complex state implementation with useState as well, but a better, more readable, more scalable approach is using useReducer hook. So yes, both useState and useReducer hooks are used for state creation and management of states. In case of useState, you get a state and a setter function for the state. In case of useReducer, you get a state and a dispatch method. Using the dispatch method, you can dispatch actions, and based on those actions, you can perform operations on your state to mutate or change your state. Yes, the state is immutable, so the state cannot be updated, but you can completely replace the state with some new value, right? So the useReducer hook sort of follows the Redux pattern, or you can say Redux follows the useReducer pattern, but useReducer follows the Redux pattern because Redux was before useReducer. How it follows the Redux pattern? Because in case of useReducer, there's a state, there are actions, and there are reducer functions. Just like in Redux toolkit, we have store, actions and reducers. So in this case, we have a state, we have actions, and we have reducer. And this is sort of, in a way, the whole useState thing is segregated or divided into pieces, which makes it more scalable and more manageable, right? So let's see on the screen. Now I have this basic function created get products, which we will be implementing and updating. But before that, let's just talk about a few things related to the useReducer hook, right? So the useReducer hook has three main things that you have to focus on: the state, pardon my handwriting, then actions, and then the reducer function, right? So what happens is a state is created just like we create using useState. It can be anything. It can be a string, it can be a number, it can be an object. Generally we use objects because, like I said, complex state handling can be done using useReducer. For simple state, like if you have a simple string in the state, you should definitely go with useState, don't worry. If you have a complex object in which you have, let's say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 fields, and the fields are also maybe array, string, number, boolean, etc., a mix of everything, then you should go with useReducer. Implementation can also be done for complex object using useState, but using useReducer it can be easily managed, right? The code will be more readable. You will only be dealing with dispatch, right? So it becomes easier. Don't get confused about dispatch or anything. Let's start from the scratch. So there's a state can be anything, like I said. Then there are actions. Action will have a type and a payload. Don't worry if you get confused what are these. We'll talk about all these things in detail, but consider an action as a type. For example, if you have to perform a delete operation, right? So the type of the action would be delete, and payload would be, let's say there is an ID attribute and you have to delete something. Let's say there's a post and you have to delete the post with ID 1. So the type will be delete for the action and the payload would be 1. Now this is a very vague example. Obviously this is not how exactly the things work. It is very customizable and you can create any action. Don't confuse this with HTTP methods as well, right? I am just talking about, post delete, let's say. Don't confuse again with post and delete. These are HTTP. These are not related to HTTP. These are custom actions. Like you can have a action like increment. You can have increment by, whatever you want to name. You can have type for your action, and payload can also take in any object, right? So this type is a custom thing that you will be creating when you will be defining your useReducer mechanism. Okay. Now this reducer is a function which takes in state and action. Okay. And inside of this reducer function, what we do is inside the reducer, based on the action that, okay, you have received action of type A or B or C, you will have an if else condition or a switch case, and you will perform some updation of the state. Obviously you will not update the state because like I said, the state is immutable, but you will reset it. You will reset it to some other value based on whatever action type you have received. So that is done inside the reducer function. And once the state is updated, this reducer function will make sure that the state that is being used or that is being managed using the useReducer hook is updated, and it is available to the components that are accessing it. Okay, so that's the more or less the gist of how useReducer work. There is a state, there are actions using which you want to modify the state, takes payload, some value, some field that you want to add to maybe the state. Then comes the reducer function, which takes in action and the original state and updates the state based on the action, whether it's A, B or C, D, whatever the action type is received. Based on that action type, you perform some change into the state, update the state completely, reset it, make a copy of it, make some modifications and reset the complete main state, and the task is done. So useReducer basically, makes the state management process bit modular and scalable, like I've repeated it a couple of times already. And it is useful where you have complex states to manage. So without wasting any time, let's move on to the example. Once you will see an example, you will have a better understanding. So I have a fetch data basic component that I have created over here. Ignore this, in this particular I have created basic states. So I wanted to show you guys how the implementation looks like using useState and how it will be modified when you will be using useReducer. So ideally, when we fetch some data from an API, we have three states, basic three states: loading to show that okay, data is being fetched, error if there is an error in data fetching, and the data if the data is fetched successfully, then data can be displayed in the user interface. That's what we have. We have three states over here: loading, error and data. And then in the get products, what I've done is I've made a fetch call to a free API where we will be fetching some random dog images. Then we have implemented promise handling. So over here, what I will be doing is I will be setting the data, because in this, then I will get access to the data. After I've converted the response to JSON, in here, I will get the access to the data that I'm fetching from this particular API. So this is the place where we can set the data into the state, which is also named data only. So don't get confused. This is data. This is, let's say this is rest data, which is response data. So response data is set into the data state. And this particular, what we are doing over here is we're showing the message out of this data in the JSX code. Okay. So data is set. Then what else we have? We have loading state and we have error state. So as soon as we get into the get products function execution, we should be setting the loading state as true, because the data fetching process is initiated and we are in the process of fetching the data from the API. Okay. And when the data is fetched, then the loading state should be made false. That okay, now the data has been fetched, so the loading state can be turned into false. When we catch an error, we can set the error as true. All right. And over here as well, loading should be turned as false. And ideally, we should set the error over here false, because if in the previous execution there was an error, then we need to hide it for the consecutive, for the next call. So this is a basic setup. This is how it should look, right? And this requires, let's say, at least six setting of states, right? Let's quickly run it and see if it's working fine or not. In here, we're not able to see anything because I think we have not added this fetch data to the app.js. So let's add that. In this app.js, let's add the fetch data component, and over here we should be able to see, okay, so we are seeing a button get dog image. If I'm clicking on it, loading, and we're getting the dog image. Okay, so this is working fine for us. This is a basic setup using state. You will be executing it like this. Now what we have to do is we have to execute this particular using the useReducer hook, right? So we have multiple 3 states and we are using 6 times the settings of state. Now one thing that you would argue is that, okay, I can make a complex state. For example, something like, an object that I can store in the state with loading and data and error as the key. And you can store the data in these as well, here object and here true or false, whatever. So in this way also you can have a single state to hold this particular object and then manage it over here. You can do it that way as well, but it will become complex. When you will write the code over here, you will see that the code is less readable. It is more complex to understand. And as the size of this object increases, this will become more and more tedious. So over here we have just 3 properties that we will be handling inside an object if we have to move it into one single object. But if this is, let's say, 10, then what? Then it will become more complex. So in this example we are dealing with 3, but it can be more than 10, 15 or whatever, right? It can be a very complex object as well. Okay, so let's move the code and let's change things a bit. So now the question is, how do we implement this using the useReducer hook? Now in useReducer, as we talked about in the beginning of this video, there are 3 things, very important things. One is the initial state, second is the actions, and third is the reducer function. So what we will do is, we'll just clean this up, or let's just keep this. So let's create a new file over here, which we will name as fetchReducer.js, and inside of this let's make a const exported initial state. Okay, initial state would be the object that we will be dealing with in this particular example. Sorry, we have to export this, and in this we will have loading. By default, let's say it is false. Then there is a data empty object, and then there is a error. All right, and false too. So this would be the initial state. This would be the state that we will be providing to the reducer. Okay, the second thing is the actions. Now you can either have basic string based actions and use them directly as a string in your code, but I would suggest that you create an object over here for actions as well. Define the types of the action so that, you know, in the code you don't make any mistake or misspell any string of type. All right, so what we will do is we'll have another export const actions, and over here let's make it capitals actions. And in this, now we're not sure about what actions we will have in this, or let's say what we can do is we can have fetch start. Fetch start would be, you know, the start of fetching, which will in a way signify that okay, loading should be modified. Then fetch complete would be when we get the data. All right, and we can have one more, fetch error, which means that fetching was ended because of some error. All right, so these are the actions that we have created. Now the initial state is set, we have actions that we have created. All right, now don't get confused that, you know, this is the only way that you have to create actions. You can also have simple direct strings as actions. Why I have created this in an object format is just to, you know, avoid mistakes. So let's just, you know, let's not confuse you guys and comment this for now. We will include this later on, right? So the next thing that we will do over here is we will define our reducer function. How we can do that? So I'm naming it reducer only, and this is what our function will look like. Sorry, mix of both words. All right, so this is the reducer function that we have created, or we can also name it data reducer. All right, so this is the function, and in the reducer function, if you remember, this reducer function will have 2 things because it has to operate on state. This is the function which is responsible for making changes to the state. And how it will make changes to the state? Based on the action type that is received as an argument. So it will take 2 things, action and state. State, why? Because it has to modify the state, make changes to it. Action, because based on action, it will make sure that what changes are to be done to the state. All right, so that's why this data reducer will take 2 things, state and action. Now inside of this, what we will do is we'll have a basic if else condition, like, you know, if action dot type. So like I said, action has 2 things. I mentioned this initially as well, that action have 2 values inside of it. One is so the action would have type and payload. All right, so based on the type we will make some modification. In the payload it will bring some data along. So you'll see whenever we fire or whenever we dispatch an action, we can add data to it. Obviously when fetch data gets completed over here, I will have to set this data in my state. So how will I do that? I will dispatch an action that okay, fetch is complete, along with some data that okay, this is the data that I have received, so that the data reducer gets that data and can add the data into the state. All right, so that's what we have to do, right? So over here what we will do is, like, if action type is fetch start, we do something, else if action dot type is equal to let's say fetch complete, and then we do something, and else if the action type is error, then we do something. Now either you can do it like this, or you can also have a switch statement. Switch is better. I wanted to show you if else because if else is more verbose and it's easier for human mind to see and understand, okay, if else, because that's how we talk in general life as well, or that's how we see situations in general life as well. So if, else if. We can do it like this also, but an ideal implementation would be using switch case, and you will see a lot of switch case examples. So let's convert this into switch case. How will we do that? I will do switch. I will do this switch. The key would be action type, action.type, and the value would be either fetch start, let's say, then the next state could be fetch complete, and inside of this last one would be fetch error, and we will have a default as well. So now these are the implementation. Here we have to write implementation that, okay, modify state, and here we will modify state, and here we will modify state. Default, in case of default, because if none of the action type matches, what we will do is we'll just return the state. If none of the action matches, just return the state as it is. Right, no changes to the state will be made. So this is a basic template of the data reducer, right? So we have set a basic reducer. We are not modifying the state as of now because I don't want to make it too quick for you. So the reducer is set, the initial state is set, actions are defined. Yes, we have not defined the action over here, but that's okay. This would be string matching. So like this. Now why I wanted to create it like this, because over here, let's say you mistyped this, and which is very easy. It won't give you any error because this is just a string, but your reducer will malfunction. So a better way is to define an object once, be careful while defining it, and then you can over and over again and again use it. How we will use it? We'll just type in that actions dot fetch start. So it will automatically pick up the right string, right? So this makes it easier. Creating an object makes it easier, right? So let's just move to the objects style now, fetch complete and fetch error. All right. So these are the three action types that we will be handling in our reducer, and we will be modifying our state based on these action type. So this is ready. The premise is set. My initial state is set. My actions are defined. My data reducer is acting on my state based on my action. These three things are fine, right? Now what? Now how do you use the useReducer hook? So for that, let's just get away with this useState because we don't need this anymore. So this is how you use the useReducer hook. More or less like useState only, but yeah, slightly different. So what we will do is over here we get state, access to state, and we get access to the dispatch, one common dispatch method. And I will be using useReducer over here. And in the useReducer, what I will do is I will provide my data reducer, which is sort of the core, which is sort of the engine that is actually acting on the state based on the action. So this is the engine of the whole system, data reducer, the function that we defined over here, because over here we are writing the entire logic that which action will trigger what change to the state. All right. So in useReducer, I will provide that, okay, this is my data reducer and this is my initial state. Initial state is this. Now, in a way, this is like useState, right? In useState also, we provide an initial state or an initial default value to the state, and then we get a setter function using which we can set or modify the state. In reducer, what we are getting is we are also getting a way to set the state or modify the state, but it is via dispatch and data reducer. Using dispatch, we will fire some action type, and using data reducer, that will be, sort of the logic will be executed based on action type, and that will modify the state. So in a way, a bit modular, a bit distributed, but doing the same thing that useState used to do. So with this, the basic setup is ready. We have initial state, action and reducer set. We have useReducer hook ready and armed up. All we have to do is we have to dispatch events and use the reducer to modify the state, right? So first of all, let me just remove these set state methods because these are causing some error. It will be gone from here and from here. So earlier what we had was we had separate states for loading data and error. Now what we have is we have an object in which loading, data and error are key. And this object is represented by the state variable. So this will be changed by state dot, so state is the state object, loading will access the loading key of that particular object, and state dot data and state dot error, and this is done. Yeah, so error's gone. Okay, so basic setup is done. Now it's time for us to dispatch an action from here and make modification to our reducer function so that we can handle the action type over here and make modifications to our state. So what we will do is, let's fire the basic loading action type, because that is the first action that should be triggered after we get into get products. So from here, I will be firing dispatch actions dot fetch start. So this will fire in the fetch start action type and will be handled over here. What we have to do over here is we have to simply return the modified state of object or the new state, right? We cannot obviously modify the state because state is immutable, but we can completely change the state. So what we will do is loading would be true now, data would still be empty, and error would be false. And yep, this part is complete, right? So the first switch case is complete. In the second one, so let's complete the error one first. Over here, I will have fetch error, and this will be handled over here. And inside of this, we will return loading will be false, data will still be empty, and error will be true in this particular case. All right, makes sense? Now comes the third and the last action type. In this case, we will be dealing with two things, not just action type, but payload as well. So this is action type that we are sending. Along with this, we will also send the payload, which is the response data for us. And that's it. This will be dispatched and handled in this particular switch case. Over here, we will return loading true, no, loading false. Data would be action dot payload, and this error would be false. All right, so this is done and the whole setup is sort of ready, right? So now as you can see, the entire state modification logic is inside one single file, which is fetch reducer. Over here, I've defined the initial state, I've defined my actions, and I've defined the function, reducer function, which acts upon the state based on the action. Whatever action you dispatch, based on that action, either you can implement it using if else or switch case. We are making changes to the state and we are just returning a new state, right? And over here, what we did was we used the useReducer hook. Inside the useReducer hook, we provided it two things. One is the reducer function, which is the main core engine or logic of state modification based on the actions. And we provided it, okay, this is the initial state on which you have to work. And in return, it gave us the state variable and a dispatch function that we can use to dispatch different events or actions, sorry, not events, action types. All right. So here the code is complete. Now let's see if this is working or not. Get dog image. Okay, it is not working for some reason. Doing nothing. Why? What are the warnings that we're getting? IMG elements must have an alt prop either. Fetch reducer has some unreachable code. What is the unreachable code over here? Okay, so we don't need this break because we are anyways returning stuff. So if a switch case returns from here itself, then we don't need a break statement because the code execution will stop here, right? Ideally this should work, but I'm not able to understand why it's not working. Okay, one thing I missed. This is not how you fire a dispatch call. Sorry, my bad. We have to share an object from here. I got carried away with the flow. So this is how we have to do it, right? Sorry guys. So it has to be an object that we have to send with type and payload. Sorry, yeah, payload. So over here also what we will do is the type would be specified as this and the payload will be specified as response data. Why? Because dispatch is only taking action with it, right? An action will have a type and a payload. So it has to be an object. Yes, the payload is optional. So you can either share just type in an object, type and whatever type you want to fire the action for, or you can include payload as well. So my bad. Over here, we don't need payload. We just need error. Yeah, now it should work. I don't know how I missed it. Get dog image, loading, and you can see the dog image. If I click on it again, it will appear again. And let's see if we can create or lead to some error. So if I delete this, oops, something went wrong. So the error state is also working fine. Loading, and oops, something went wrong. Perfect. JSON, and yeah, it will start to work again. So as you can see, the main things to notice over here is inside this. So we separately create the state, which is very important. So as you can see over here, why my mouse is not working, we have set an initial state over here, right? It can be any object that you want to create. Then we have a list of actions. This is also good practice to create actions separately. And then what you have is you have a main reducer function, which is where you define the entire logic that how actions will affect the state. Action will have type based on which we can write the logic like this, switch cases, and action will have payload using which we can modify the state. All right. And then we can simply use the useReducer hook, provided that, okay, this is your reducer function, which will handle the entire logic. And this is your initial state. Give me a dispatch and a state. And using the dispatch that you provide me, I'll fire some actions. Those actions will be handled by the reducer and my state modification will be done. So this is how useReducer hook works with state. Quite similar to useState, because eventually states are getting modified and user interfaces being re-rendered. But yeah, it's slightly different. It is done through actions and a different function, not directly like useState does. So this is all about useReducer, right? In the next video, I'll try to share one more example with you using useReducer so that you completely understand how you can use useReducer hook to manage your state. So in the next example, what I will do is I'll have a form, a proper form, a long form, and the entire fields of that form will be associated with some state fields and one large state object. And when the user will modify the form fields, will dispatch some actions to modify the state, and eventually at form submission will use the state and will do the action that form submission would want to do, right? So that's the example that I will share in the next video so that you get a better understanding of useReducer hook. All right, so that was it for this video. Thank you so much for watching the video till the end. If you have any confusion or any doubt about useReducer, please share in the comment section below. I'll be more than happy to assist you, help you, guide you, and discuss any issue, any confusion that you have regarding this particular topic. It can be a little tricky, but I've tried my best to explain it. Still, if you have any doubts, please post your comments. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do it. Let's reach 100K very soon. So stay tuned, keep watching, subscribe, share, like, comment, do whatever you want to do with the video, share it around. Just, make it reach as many users as it can. Thank you so much for watching the video. See you in the next one.